Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the 10th in a series of programs I'm doing on morality and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. In my last program in this series, I explored the possibility of using a particular moral principle as a guide. Specifically, hurt no one, rather help all as much as you can. I pointed out that while hurt no one sounds good, there is a problem. The problem specifically is that people don't always agree on whether certain behaviors, certain actions are helping or hurting people. Obvious historical examples would be slavery and imperialism. Incredible as it may seem, there have been many prominent people over the centuries who argued that slavery was not only not evil, but actually good, a positive good. And indeed, before the Civil War, there were those who argued in the United States that slaves were well cared for and happy. I must tell you that historians have accumulated more than ample evidence indicating that slavery was arbitrary, cruel, and often barbaric. I also pointed out that many Christian nations over the centuries have both approved of slavery and participated in the slave trade, participated in the slave business, which at one time was big business. Another example of people disagreeing about whether certain actions or behaviors are hurting or helping other people is imperialism. Imperialism, of course, is the act of one country taking over another country. Most of the powerful countries in the world over the centuries have engaged in imperialism. For example, Spain in the 1600s was the most powerful country in the world, and as you will recall, was ruling most of what is now referred to as Latin America. England later replaced Spain as the most powerful country in the world and the most powerful imperialist country in the world. England, of course, ruled India. It also ruled Canada, Australia, much of Africa, and also other areas of the world. Indeed, England's empire was so huge that it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. The idea being the sun was always shining somewhere on the British Empire, since the British had possessions in so many different areas of the world. 20th century Germany, of course, also engaged in imperialism under Hitler. Indeed, the Nazis took over approximately 10 European countries. And Japan, another enemy of the United States during World War II, prior to World War II, had taken over several countries, including Korea and large sections of China. And of course, the old Soviet Union took over so much of Eastern Europe, almost all of what we now refer to as Eastern Europe. And I've pointed out, the United States, yes, our country, also engaged in imperialism. the United States also took over other countries without their permission. Among the areas the U.S. took over were Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Later, in the 1940s, after ruling the Philippines for about 50 years, we gave them their independence. And more recently, we have given the people of Puerto Rico a choice as to whether to remain a part of the United States or to become independent. But that wasn't done until pretty recently. The imperialist countries, the colonizers, generally claimed that they were doing good in taking over other countries because they could uplift the people of those countries and also modernize those countries. Of course, this often masked some selfish motives, many selfish motives the imperialist countries often had, such as the desire for natural resources, markets, cheap labor, and also status. The idea was if a country could control several other countries, it was a point of status. That country would now appear to be more important in the eyes of the other countries of the world, so that many of the imperialist countries, the colonizers, believed that one way to accrue status would be, again, to take over other countries. Very often, the victims of imperialism were not treated with respect or concern. Remember, I'm talking about a moral principle as being a possible guide to morality. Specifically, hurt no one, help all as much as you can. Perhaps the most obvious recent example of how people can disagree about the implementation of this principle is the current Iraq War. The question is our participation, is the United States' participation in this war moral? There is, of course, disagreement about whether we are helping or hurting Iraqis, and also whether we are helping or hurting ourselves. The Iraq War, I think, is a clear illustration of the fact that people not infrequently disagree about what is moral and what is evil. In this program today, I will focus on another possible guide to morality. It's a moral principle. You have often heard it referred to as the Golden Rule. A famous Jewish rabbi, Hillel, phrased it this way: what is hateful to thyself, do not do to another. What is hateful to thyself, do not do to another. After expressing this principle, the famous Rabbi Hillel allegedly said, "This is all the moral law. The rest is commentary." Again, what is hateful to thyself, do not do to another. I like it, but it doesn't cover every moral dilemma. That's right, it doesn't cover every moral dilemma. For example, what if one takes illegal drugs and likes taking illegal drugs and doesn't believe it's wrong to take illegal drugs and consequently begins selling illegal drugs to others, again, not believing it's wrong? What if a father, when he was young, was physically beat up by his father as a form of punishment and thinks to this day that it's good that his father beat him up, it's a good way of disciplining children, and he proceeds to discipline his own sons in the same way? Another example, What if one grew up in a part of the world where arranged marriages are part of the culture, and one's own marriage was arranged, indeed dictated by one's parents, whereby your parents told you whom you were going to marry? And perhaps it's worked out pretty well for you, and now you proceed to dictate to your own children whom they will marry, thinking again you're not hurting them, but helping them. Indeed, Mahatma Gandhi, the very famous Mahatma Gandhi's marriage, was arranged when he and his wife were both 13 years old, and got married when they were 13 years of age. Nelson Mandela, the famous African leader, his guardian arranged a marriage for him when he was a teenager, and Mandela was so opposed to marrying the girl his guardian had selected that Mandela ran away from home, never to return. The main question I've been dealing with in this series on morality is this: what should be our guide in determining what's good and what's bad? In past programs, I've talked at length about using one of various possible guides. I've talked about using one's conscience as a guide, a holy book, one's reason or intellect, the law of the land, the probable consequences of our behavior, and again, a moral principle, such as the golden rule. It seems that while each of these can be valuable, none is the perfect moral guide. It seems there are problems in using any one of them. I've pointed out, for example, that prominent religious thinkers over the centuries have disagreed about what is moral. Some famous religious thinkers have used a holy book to justify burning people to death who believed, burning people to death for what they believed were heretical religious beliefs. Also, prominent religious people over the centuries, and even today, some are using a holy book to justify suicide bombing. Some have used a holy book to justify slavery and to justify the burning to death of women who they claimed were witches. Indeed, historian Will Durant says that approximately 100,000 people, mostly women, were burned to death in Europe over the centuries because they had been accused of being witches. I think it's fair to say most historians today believe that these people who are accused of being witches were really mentally ill. And of course, some religious thinkers over the centuries have used a holy book to justify the subservience of women to men. But it's not just famous religious people who have disagreed about what is moral. Famous philosophers, psychologists, psychiatrists, men and women of letters have also often disagreed about what is good and what is evil. For example, Plato, arguably the most famous of philosophers, Plato did not believe in democracy. Plato did not believe in democracy. Rather, he believed the best kind of government was a form of totalitarianism, which in fact involved censoring the media. Some famous thinkers have believed in God. Some haven't. Among the famous thinkers who have believed in God were Kant, Descartes, and Pascal. And among famous thinkers who have not believed in God, but rather were atheists, were Nietzsche, Freud, and Bertrand Russell. And there have been some thinkers who apparently believed in God, but not in organized religion. Again, thinkers who believed in God, but not in organized religion. And among the thinkers whom I think it's fair to place in this category would be Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous American lecturer and writer, and perhaps Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. There are historians who claim that Lincoln believed in God, but not in organized religion. We know that Lincoln was not a regular churchgoer. That we know. Well, what to do, since so many famous thinkers have disagreed about what is moral? Well, for me, I think a very famous French thinker, D'Holbach, that's spelled capital D''Holbach, D'Holbach, I think, provides the best guidelines I know of to determine what is moral and what is not. He claimed we need more than one guide. He believed, for example, that the best we can hope for is a conscience formed by a better education, and an acquired habit of looking forward to the consequences of our behavior on others and ourselves. Again, we must use our conscience, but also consider the possible consequences of our behavior. And also, he believed that something else that would be helpful to all of us would be a healthier public opinion, a more intelligent public opinion about what is good and what is moral. Let me now dissect what D'Holbach is talking about. Let me get very specific in terms of attempting to explain what this famous French philosopher believed we should all do in determining morality. Again, he believed we need a conscience formed by a better education. What does that mean? Well, in other words, a conscience formed by critical thinking. A conscience formed by critical thinking. And what does that mean? Well, let me give you an example. Well, first of all, what it means is that we must engage in introspection, in self-examination. Allow me an example. If a person lives in a society that finds it acceptable to discriminate against people on the basis of ethnicity, sex, or religion, and was raised not to feel guilty about discriminating against blacks, Jews, Sunnis, Shiites, women, or gays, that person has to examine his or her conscience to determine whether the conscience is guiding oneself properly. One needs an informed conscience. Again, one needs an informed conscience. One has to realize that all societies are morally sick in one way or another, and therefore one must think critically about one's own society and the values of one's own society. I think the poet Walt Whitman provides some illumination here. Whitman, arguably the greatest of American poets, on the subject of critical thinking said this, and I'm quoting him: "Re-examine all you have been told in school or in church or in any book, and dismiss whatever insults your soul. D'Holbach, this very famous French thinker, believed we must use our reason in conjunction with our conscience to determine what's moral, and he believed there are certain aids to thinking clearly. Again, certain aids to thinking clearly. Well, what might they be? Well, first of all, it has to be pointed out that it's very difficult to completely divorce our feelings from our thinking, that our feelings often lead us to certain thoughts, so that if we are going to think more clearly, we must in some way or another attempt to change our feelings. Allow me to explain. If we are trying to determine whether something is moral and we are feeling angry and hateful, we probably will not do our best thinking when we are feeling angry and especially hateful. Whereas, if we can make a serious effort to cultivate empathy, compassion, and love, they will guide us to reasoning more clearly. Again, compassion, empathy, and love can be important aids to thinking more clearly, whereas hatred can be an important impediment to thinking clearly. The idea is, if I can summarize it in this way, if we can use reason in conjunction with empathy and compassion, that will almost certainly yield a significant result in our thinking, a different result in our thinking than if we use reason in conjunction with hatred. The scholar Houston Smith provides some illumination here, and a good summary statement, I think. Unless our hearts prompt us to cooperate, reason will devise clever strategies to further self-interest. Allow me to say that again. Unless our hearts prompt us to cooperate, reason will devise clever strategies to further self-interest. In other words, what we really need is an educated heart. It's been said that both Jesus and Buddha believed that the only moral law really is love. The key to moral behavior, in other words, is introspection, which involves self-examination and self-criticism. And also, introspection involves criticism of the world's values and of our own society's values. If we're going to become very moral people, it's very important we become good critical thinkers and independent thinkers, that at times we be able to divorce ourselves from the way in which the majority of people think, because so often the majority, when it comes to morals, is wrong. Remember, the majority of people in America went along with slavery. The majority of people in Germany went along with Nazism. The ancient Greeks believed the foundation of wisdom is knowing thyself. Know thyself. The idea is a more moral life requires daily moments of solitude and silence. Again, a more moral life requires daily moments of silence and solitude so that we can do our best thinking. We cannot do our best thinking in a crowd. We cannot do our best thinking while watching television or listening to the radio. The world, and even our own society, can often confuse us as to what is moral and immoral. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor whose wife perished in a concentration camp and also who lost several other people because of the Nazis. Several of his family members died in concentration camps. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl claimed that decent people are in a minority in the world, and that our challenge in life is to join the minority. So many famous thinkers have articulated similar ideas. Freud, in describing human nature, said man is a wolf to man. Carl Jung, another very famous psychiatrist, said most people think they're more moral than they are. Most people assume they're more moral than they are. Jean-Paul Sartre, famous French thinker, said this: hell is other people. And Socrates, arguably the greatest of philosophers, Socrates said, there is much imbalance in all men. He could have added women. There is much imbalance in all men and women. Allow me that addition. Willie Morris, a very famous writer, on the subject of the very moral person, said this, and I think this is illuminating. Morris said, the gentlest person is that person who has warred the most, battled the most against his own inner violence. I have little doubt that Buddha, Jesus, and Freud would agree with that. Finally, the French philosopher Blaise Pascal claimed that the very moral person has both self-respect and self-contempt. That the very moral person has self-respect because he or she is trying very hard to be a good person. But the very moral person also has self-contempt, realizing that one is never as good as one should be. Finally, as is my custom, I'd like to close with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in Walden, his masterpiece, claimed that we are all artists. He penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.